In 1944, as the war in the Pacific raged on, American moviegoers lined up to watch Spencer Tracy in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. In the movie, Tracy played war hero and pilot Jimmy Doolittle, whose successful bombing run over Japan made him an instant legend. But who was the real man behind that legend, and what was the effect of his raid?
They were 80 men who volunteered for a top-secret mission into enemy territory. In one of America's darkest hours, they brought a kind of heroic light. Their leader made his men believe that they could do anything, and they did. And in the end, their effort would change the course of World War II. This is the real story of the Doolittle Raiders and their 1 hour over Tokyo. It is an honor reserved for only the top Air Force cadets. A case containing 80 silver goblets is carefully packed. On every cup is engraved a name. Every name is the name of a hero. These cups are readied to make the journey to where the surviving heroes gather, to remember, to reflect, and to bid farewell.
I still am a firm believer that none of us thought ourselves as heroes. The guy that was leading us was a hero.
I don't really feel like I did anything more than anyone else. There were 10 or so million of us in the service, and we all did what we could do, what we had to do.
We don't look at the event as being extraordinary. It had some extraordinary elements in it, which we are proud that we were able to accomplish.
December 8, 1941. As Pearl Harbor smoldered, the world's most powerful nation was on the defensive. The once mighty Pacific Fleet was in disarray. But beyond the physical destruction, it was the psychological blow that impacted Americans most. And it propelled the country on a mission to retaliate.
The people were in deep shock. The country was in deep shock. The government was in deep shock.
U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted immediate action. He felt the only way to lift American morale was to strike the Japanese on their own soil, but that would not be easy. Japanese forces were well entrenched in the Pacific and were closing in on the Philippines. Without a secure air base in the Pacific, U.S. bombers were of no use because of their limited range. And a naval assault was impossible since much of the fleet was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. Still, President Roosevelt was adamant. America must strike back. The solution to this challenge came unexpectedly when Navy submariner Captain Francis Lowe was flying to Virginia.
He saw some Army bombers taking off from a Navy practice field. And he noticed that the practice field was laid out like a carrier and that the Navy planes were using it for practice takeoffs. And he wondered whether Army bombers might be used to take off from a carrier.
King approved the concept and passed the idea to General Hap Arnold, the Army Air Corps chief. Now, Arnold needed a man to lead the mission. He turned to 45-year-old legendary aviator and former World War I pilot Jimmy Doolittle.
Jimmy Doolittle was a well-known racing pilot during the late 20s and 30s. He was a stunt pilot, but he was a master of the calculated risk. He never did any of these daring stunt flights without practicing first.
After considering several options, Doolittle decided the Mitchell B-25B bomber would be the best plane for the mission if it were modified. Originally built in 1938, it had the range and load capacity necessary, and unlike other bombers, it was fast and agile. But the B-25, like all Army bombers at the time, was not designed to take off from an aircraft carrier. It needed a minimum of 750 feet to take off. A carrier's deck was only 450. Still, Doolittle felt that experienced pilots could be trained for the short takeoffs that would be required. After choosing the plane, Doolittle went to work finding the best men to pull off such a dangerous mission. He would need 80 men to form 16 five-man crews. He chose the 17th Bombardment Group stationed at Pendleton, Oregon, because of their experience flying the B-25. The men were in their 20s and represented nearly every state in America.
We had heard the day before that Colonel Doolittle was coming in, and of course, anyone flying knew what Doolittle's skills and history was. He walked up on the stage, he said, "I am Colonel Doolittle."
He said, "We're going to form a dangerous mission. Some of you fellows are going to get killed. How many of you will volunteer?"
The whole group volunteered, as far as that's concerned. So he had all the volunteers plus.
As I remember, I couldn't volunteer fast enough because I wanted to retaliate.
You could hardly hold anybody back. That's youth, 22 years old.
Not only was the mission dangerous, it would have to be kept a secret even from the men who volunteered.
He told us and says, "Don't even talk amongst yourselves what you think you might be doing. And certainly not to anybody else. Don't even tell anybody why you might be here."
Doolittle now had his team and the plane he felt could carry them into Japan. But the B-25 had never taken off from a carrier empty, let alone with a full complement of bombs, extra fuel tanks, and a crew of 5. And time was not on Doolittle's side. With the country still in shock from Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt wanted some kind of retaliation, and quickly. By the time Doolittle's men went to work on their orders in January 1942, American morale was still badly shaken from the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the Pacific, Singapore was in Japanese hands, and General Douglas MacArthur had retreated from the Philippines. With few Allied ships left and no secure airbase, America and its allies were in retreat. Training for their mission at Eglin Field in Florida, the Raiders were to learn to lift their B-25s in the short distance of an aircraft carrier's deck, fly at low level over the water, and bomb what at this point were undisclosed targets. The men still didn't know where they were going, but they did know how they were getting there, tucked inside a B-25, loaded with fuel and armed with 4 500-pound bombs. While the flight crews trained, mechanics went to work on the B-25s. Among the revisions was the installation of 2 black broomsticks fashioned to resemble machine guns and placed in the tail cone in the hope that any approaching Japanese pilots would think twice about attacking from the rear. Atop the B-25s, 2 .50 caliber machine guns would give the Raiders their only defense. It took just 4 weeks for the men to master the short-distance takeoff. Then, on March 23rd, with speculation among the men regarding their mission mounting, Jimmy Doolittle got the call.
So Jimmy was given the word through Washington, and the message was, "Tell Jimmy to get on his horse."
The men were ordered to fly their planes to the Alameda Naval Base in the San Francisco Bay. Flying in, they could see the Hornet, the Navy's newest carrier, waiting for them.
Well, the Navy at first was madder than the hatter that they were putting Army aircraft on their carrier. And the Navy people resented the idea that they were being used as a freighter to haul their Army aircraft from one point to the next.
While Navy personnel loaded the planes aboard the Hornet, the men, still unaware of their destination, went into San Francisco for one last night on the town.
They told us all we could have shore leave that night, so we went up to the top of the Mark Hopkins to be wined and dined, and turned around and looked down at the bay, and there sat the carrier out in the middle of the bay with 16 B-25s on the deck. All the speculation in the top of the Mark was that, where are they going to those B-25s?
The next day, the men boarded the Hornet. At 10:15 a.m. on April 2nd, 1942, the ship pulled anchor and headed for the open sea. It was time for the men to learn their fate, a fate that would bind the Army pilots and their Navy escorts.
I can remember just as vividly going by Alcatraz, going under the Golden Gate, and going out into the open Pacific. We got out there, and the captain come on, and he says, "Hear ye, hear ye." He says, "This is to inform you that we're headed for Tokyo." And there was like at a football game when somebody kicked a field goal at the last second.
This force is bound for Tokyo. And that was a great moment.
At sea, the Hornet joined with Admiral Bull Halsey's carrier Enterprise, which would provide air support for the mission and serve as flagship for the 16-vessel escort. During the 2-week voyage, Doolittle's men were given the details of their mission. The plan was for the carrier to move within 450 miles of Japan. They would launch at 6 p.m. in order to arrive over Japan at night and bomb military targets in Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. The raiders would then fly to a predetermined airfield inside unoccupied China, where the planes would refuel and move to safety further inland. The plan left little margin for error, as the B-25s had just enough fuel to reach China. But Doolittle, master of the calculated risk, felt the odds were in his favor. Once they learned their mission, Doolittle gathered his men and ceremoniously placed a Japanese peacetime medal on one of the bombs bound for Tokyo. The reality of the mission was taking shape, and spirits were high. But then disaster struck. 200 miles from the launch point, a full day before the men were to take off, a Japanese fishing boat spotted the convoy. After confirming that the ship had radioed Tokyo, the cruiser Nashville opened fire, sinking the vessel. The surprise attack was now in jeopardy.
They hoped to get within 450 miles of Japan before they would launch the B-25s. However, when they were intercepted by this fishing boat, they were about 650 miles out.
Halsey and Doolittle had a decision to make. Continue on and risk putting 2 of the Navy's 5 aircraft carriers at risk, turn back and abort the mission, or launch at once. If they decided to launch, not only would they arrive over their targets in broad daylight, but their planes might not have enough fuel to reach the safety of their air bases in China. Fate had turned a risky mission into a seemingly suicidal one.
We felt like that we were a little bit too far out, and that was a little bit dangerous. We didn't know for positive, you know, how far we could fly.
We heard over the loudspeaker that Army crews man your airplanes, so immediately we started going back to our quarters and gathering our gear together and getting it to our airplane.
The decision was to launch. And Jimmy Doolittle, the pioneer who had achieved so many firsts in aviation, would be the first to attempt the takeoff. Co-pilot Richard Cole and navigator Hank Potter were on Doolittle's crew.
It would be, I think, a pretty bad feeling to everybody behind us if we took off and dropped in the water.
We were particularly confident. We had the best pilot in the Air Force flying us.
As Doolittle and his crew sat at the takeoff point on the deck, heavy seas and a 30-knot headwind battered the Hornet. It was 8:20 a.m., April 18, 1942, just over 4 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The Navy signalman he would give you this to rev up your engines, and in the meantime we'd have put the flaps down and have everything all ready, both of us holding the brakes, and went to full military power.
Takeoff was no sweat, and the reason it was no sweat is we were making 20 knots into the 30-knot headwind, so there was a 50-knot wind across the deck.
Jimmy Doolittle and his crew made the launch look easy. Following Doolittle's lead, the next 5 pilots lifted their planes from the carrier. Plane number 7, however, reminded everyone of how precarious success can be. Nolan Herndon watched as the plane sped down the deck to where the carrier ends and the ocean begins.
It went out of sight over the deck. Spray coming over and it dropped below it, and me sitting up there in the nose, and my friends in that airplane going down. I knew it was in the water.
In the excitement, pilot number 7 had neglected to put the flaps down on his aircraft. The plane headed for the ocean, and then the first miracle of the day happened.
It was a hand just reached out and lifted it up.
After the near disaster, the remaining Raiders successfully lifted off the Hornet.
I just wondered if I should have stayed on that carrier that day.
As soon as the last plane cleared the deck, the convoy turned around and headed back to Pearl Harbor. 80 men and 16 planes were now on a one-way mission into enemy territory.
The 2 big concerns we had, the first was getting off that carrier, and second, where would we end up?
When I left from there, that's when the thing hit me. Well, where in the heck are you gonna be tonight?
Each B-25 crew was now on its own. Ahead of them was the unknown, and all felt a restless uncertainty.
23rd Psalm, I kept saying it over and over and over and over and over and over. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
When Jimmy Doolittle's men launched on April 18, 1942, America and its allies were being pummeled in the Pacific. The Bataan Peninsula had fallen, and British forces were retreating in Burma. But the unsuspecting Japanese were in for a surprise as Doolittle's raiders were closing in on their country. Because the flyers were forced to launch early, they would now reach Japan in broad daylight. Knowing they could be spotted, the pilots guided their planes a few feet above the water to avoid detection. For 2.5 hours, the men flew through clouds and rain. But as the Japanese mainland approached, the raiders got a break.
Just as we come into Japan, the skies just cleared up. It was absolutely not a cloud in the sky.
With Tokyo in sight, Doolittle's crew number 1 flew to their assigned area and, like the others, were free to look for alternative targets.
The targets specifically were military targets. Under no circumstances were they to aim at anything else. Look for factories, look for railroad yards, look for shipyards.
Because their convoy had been spotted at sea, Doolittle's crew was surprised to encounter a weak defense as they reached the Japanese coast.
It appeared that they were going to try to intercept us. Doolittle immediately took evasive action, put on a little more power, and if they were going to try to get us, we easily outran them. And so just shortly thereafter, I was over Tokyo itself and our target.
Our target was a factory, so we pulled up 1,500 feet, dropped the bomb right back on the deck again.
The first bombs had fallen on Japan. Doolittle's first strike lasted just 2 minutes. Low on gasoline, he turned south toward safety. Meanwhile, the other raiders closed in on their target cities around Japan. Plane by plane, the men unloaded their bomb bays.
When he said bomb bay doors open, it was a great feeling, and I hope those bombs hit that target.
And after we bombed the target, our turret gunner, who could see what had happened, said we had really flattened it. We had hit the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company.
Our main target was the aircraft factory and oil storage tanks. When we dropped our bombs, we said, let's get the hell out of here, and we put full power on and got out of the area.
For Nolan Herndon, the close proximity to his enemy was unnerving.
After bombing this field, it wasn't too far along until we come over the schoolhouse. There was a lot of children out. But the way they were running and falling over one another we were just above the ground, and they had heard the explosion.
Most of the bombs hit their targets dead on, but for some, the inevitable occurred.
I did miss with my first bomb. It landed in between two buildings where there were about 6 or 8 people. The third bomb hit the block of houses there.
Like the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, the raiders had taken their enemy by surprise. From the dropping of the first bomb to the last, approximately 1 hour had passed. Now they had to find safety. But because the raiders had to leave the aircraft carrier earlier than expected, the men didn't have enough gasoline to reach their refueling site.
And after about 30, 40 minutes after leaving, we noticed the weather got real bad. Real bad, 0 weather conditions. And the old airplane was leaking all over. And for some unknown reason, that man upstairs had his arm around our neck. That wind changed. We got this tailwind, about a 35-knot tailwind, that actually pushed us into China, because we couldn't have made it. Then it started getting dark.
The raiders guided their planes to the Chinese interior, away from Japanese-occupied areas. That's when the miracle stopped and the scrambling began.
We had an airfield that was supposed to have a fuel for us, and hopefully there was supposed to have been some sort of a beacon there that we could home in with.
Unfortunately, there would be no refueling for the raiders. The American crew that was to set up the beacons had crashed on their way to the refueling site. Each crew now had a decision to make: go down with their planes or jump. Worst of all, most of the raiders had no idea if they were over occupied or free China.
Fuel was very low, and Doolittle didn't want to have our engines quit, so he decided while we were under control, we'd better bail out wherever we were. And that's what we did.
You knew the only way you were going to live was to get out of that airplane.
It was a kind of an eerie, scary feeling looking down at that black hole and jump through it.
And I swayed back and forth, and I couldn't see anything. And all of a sudden, I hit that water in one of the rice paddies.
The majority of the raiders were now scattered over 100 miles on the ground in China. After spending the night in the rain and cold, the men tried to find one another while struggling to stay out of sight from the Japanese. Fortunately, they received some unexpected help from surprised and thankful Chinese peasants. Tong Shang Lu was one of the Chinese who helped the raiders.
We faced an invasion by the Japanese soldiers. So when they heard of the General Doolittle's Tokyo raid, we were so overjoyed.
Risking their lives, the Chinese led the raiders on a cat-and-mouse game with their Japanese pursuers.
The Chinese happens to have the sedan chairs. So with two coolies, one in the front, one in the back, with two long bamboo and the chair in between to carry the American flyers.
We were so fortunate to have them. Everything was prearranged. And we'd no longer get out of a sampan that we'd get into a bus. We'd get off a bus and they'd have us on their junks. And then we get off the junk and we get back in a chair carriage. Just like clockwork.
We got to this town and there was a Chinese band. They had stayed up all night long. And when we got there, they had learned to play the Star Spangled Banner. There was an American flag. And I'll tell you, there were 5 guys in crew number 13. When they played that Star Spangled Banner, we had tears running down our face and just felt so proud to be an American.
As some of the raiders were reunited, Doolittle tried desperately to locate his missing men. For days, the great aviator was despondent, and surveying the wreckage of his plane, he lamented the situation.
Doolittle says, well, he says, I've lost all my crews. I don't know where they are. He was a very sad and worried man, not so much about himself, although he felt he was going to be punished. He was worried about his men, not knowing where they were, and that was the kind of man he was.
Slowly, Doolittle got word that most of his men had made it to safety. Meanwhile, news of the raid was making the front pages in America. It was being called the most daring air assault in history.
Bombs away. Tokyo in flames. For the first time, Japan tasted the terror of war.
Doolittle and his 79 raiders had accomplished their mission. Later, they would learn that the raid was much more successful than anyone had anticipated, but a horrific price would be paid.
After they had been caught unawares by the falling of American bombs on Tokyo, Japanese troops attacked the coastal areas of China, where many of the American flyers had landed. These Japanese troops slaughtered every man, woman, and child in those areas.
Chiang Kai-shek himself estimated that 250,000 of his people were murdered by the Japanese for helping the Americans.
I think that they were paid the price for trying to be good people and trying to help strangers whom they didn't know.
They consider that is a part of the overall sacrifice of the nation under siege.
The effort of the raiders and their Chinese protectors was not in vain, as in the end it would change the course of the war in the Pacific.
The effect on the Japanese was unprecedented, too. They decided that they had not done a proper job of stopping the Americans at Pearl Harbor. They hadn't gotten any carriers, and so the strategy was changed to take the island of Midway and push their defenses farther back. The Japanese lost disastrously.
Before the Battle of Midway, Jimmy Doolittle returned to action. He was promoted to Brigadier General and went on to receive the Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But it was the decoration for the raid on Japan of which he was most proud. And true to his character, he accepted it with grace and humility.
President Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor on his blouse, and he said there were 79 other men who shared the same risk that I took. And so I am accepting this medal on their behalf. He always said that.
Of the 80 men that left the Hornet, 64 would eventually make it to safety. Donald Fitzmaurice and William Dieter died swimming to shore after ditching their plane. Leland Factor died after his parachute failed to open. Crew number 8 had diverted to Russia and were interned because Joseph Stalin did not want to upset his already tenuous relationship with the Japanese. the crew would eventually escape to safety. That left 8 men from 2 crews unaccounted for, and they were in the hands of the enemy, an enemy that had been humiliated by the raid on their native land. After the bombing of Japan, the majority of the raiders made it to safety and many returned to action. 8 raiders, however, had been captured by the Japanese.
They said, "You're in the hand of the Japanese Imperial Army." Boy, I felt lower than a snake's belly then.
In a brutal turn of events, the raiders were to become fodder for Japanese retaliation. Interrogations and torture began on their very first day of capture.
They also held us down and poured water down our nose and all that sort of stuff. And that interrogation lasted just about 24 hours a day. What they were trying to find out was where we came from. They wanted to know what HORNET spelled. I said, "Well, that's some kind of bug. I don't know."
They just gave us maybe a piece of bread or rice for something to eat. And they'd question us for hours and hours. And I'd just keep telling them I won't talk because that's what Doolittle had told us to say if we were captured.
While Crew 16 was in Tokyo, Chase Nielsen and his crewmates from Plane 6 were still in China.
They wanted to know where I came from. What are you doing in China? Finally, this one came in and he said, "Well, I guess if you're not going to talk, we'll execute you." And of course, I told him, "Well, all I can give you is my name, rank, and serial number. And according to Geneva Convention, that's all I have to." And I said, "Oh, Geneva Convention? Yeah, we know all about that, but we don't belong."
The other raiders experienced the same tactics, but in all cases, the bluff of execution failed. So the captors used other methods to try to persuade the men to talk. Housed in 8-by-8-foot cells with no light and a hole in the floor as a toilet, the raiders suffered through solitary confinement. They were subjected to water torture and kicks in the groin. Their fingers were ripped with sharp sticks, and their knees were spread with bamboo. And through it all, the men weren't allowed to sleep or to bathe. Still, they did not talk.
He says, "You're just making it hard on yourself. They already know you came from the aircraft carrier Hornet."
Deprived of sleep, all were now suffering from dysentery and had lost considerable body weight. But the questioning continued, and it soon became obvious that the Japanese interrogators knew more than they let on.
They said, "Jimmy Doolittle was your commanding officer. Is that true?" I said, "I won't talk." They said, 16 B-25 took off the Hornet aircraft carrier. Is that true?" They had everything just right.
And I thought, well, the guys know this much, they're not going to beat the hell out of me anymore. So I started talking. And then when I could get the word to the other guys, I told them, "Look, they got all the information. There's no use taking this rough stuff. We just will go along and let them know."
During the continual beatings, the raiders began agreeing with their interrogators, all the while giving them useless or false information. Then in May, after a month of torture, they were presented with a confession. Written in Japanese, the document stated the men had purposely strafed and bombed non-military targets. They were told to sign it or be executed.
Trumped up confessions. And the reason we signed them, we said, we'll sign it. If that's what it takes to get you off our back, we'll sign them.
After the prisoners signed the statements, the interrogation stopped. The men were sent to join other POWs in another prison in Shanghai. Covered in sores and bruises, they were housed in 10-by-15-foot cells, and for the next 70 days ate rice filled with maggots and dirt. Then, 120 days after capture, the men were allowed to bathe. On August 28th, the men were sent to King Wan Military Prison and put on trial.
What they had determined was the responsible parties would be the pilot who was the airplane commander and the person that released the bombs or had fired a machine gun, they were holding those people responsible.
The rigged trial surprised no one. All of the raiders were found guilty of war crimes against the Japanese people. Pilots Dean Hallmark and William Farrow and gunner Harold Spatz were sentenced to death. On October 15, 1942, the sentences were carried out.
They had taken them out to this old Chinese cemetery. They tied them to crosses, they blindfolded them, and they were shot in the forehead.
I feel like if one should have been executed, all should have been executed.
Now there were 5: Chase Nielsen, Jacob DeShazer, Bobby Height, George Barr, and Robert Meader. The men were moved to Nanking and for the next year suffered through the torture of solitary confinement. In December of 1943, weakened by dysentery, Robert Meader died. After Meader's death, Chase Nielsen pleaded for better conditions for the remaining 4 men.
I said, we need not only something to do physically, we need something to do mentally. We haven't had a book to read or anything else. So they finally broke down and gave us 3 or 4 books to read. One of them was the Bible.
The Bible offered the men comfort during their confinement. It also changed Jacob DeShazer's life.
I started reading that Bible, and Jesus said, "Thy word is truth." I promised right there that I was going to do what he showed me to do.
For another year and a half, the men spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Then, on August 20th, 1945, just days after American planes dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan, the men were released.
A great day. When I called Dad, he was really happy. All I told him, I said, well, I hope you're happy. I said, your bad penny has returned. He said, well, you can call it that if you want. He said, I think it's great. He said, you better hurry home. And then Mother said in about 10 minutes, he'd called everybody in town and told them I was on my way home.
Chase Nielsen returned to Japan in 1946 to testify at the war crime trials. While there, he confronted and testified against 4 of his captors. They were convicted of war crimes and sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 9 years. While in Japan, Nielsen also tended to some unfinished business.
We recovered the remains of all the Doolittle raiders, and they've all been buried either in private or military cemeteries.
In 1948, Jacob DeShazer also returned to Japan.
The Lord was talking to me in those days. Seemed like he wanted me to go back.
DeShazer spent 30 years spreading the gospel to the Japanese. And while in Japan, an incredible association closed the circle that began with the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
I saw the man that led the attack on Pearl Harbor. He said that he read in my testimony that I was given the Bible, and I read the Bible and a great experience happened. So then when he went and got a Bible, and he asked God to forgive him, and he believed God did.
Mitsuo Fushida, the Japanese pilot who led the raid on Pearl Harbor, which thrust the Doolittle raiders on their incredible journey, died in 1976. Attending his funeral, the Reverend Jacob DeShazer. From the moment the raiders volunteered in early 1942 to the day when the captured flyers returned home in late 1945, nearly 4 years had passed. Upon their return to America, all 80 of the brave men were decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross. But like their leader, Jimmy Doolittle, who died in 1993 at age 96, the surviving raiders remain humble to this day.
I think we've all thanked our lucky stars. We were at the right place at the right time to be chosen, to be trained and led by Jimmy Doolittle. It changed our lives entirely.
It gave the American public a tremendous boost to get on the ball and get going. But I feel very privileged to be part of it.
They could have gotten all the volunteers in the world for this job to go do it if they were asked. But they can only use so many, and I think they selected a pretty good group of guys.
The Raiders have also honored those that risk so much for their safety.
I became an honorary Raider ever since. I'm honored as well. My friends in the Raiders group, to me, to my children, they're all my heroes. They are great men.
That 1 hour over Tokyo on April 18, 1942, bound 80 men from different backgrounds to a lifetime of friendship. And almost every year since 1945, the men reunite.
To those who gave their all in the success of our mission, and to those who have joined them since, our fondest memory, sincere appreciation, and gratitude. May they rest in peace. I will call the crew members. James H. Doolittle.
Here.
Everett Dumberly Holson.
Here, here.
Colonel Bauer, would you please reverse his cup?
If anyone has passed away, we give the toast and we turn his cup upside down.
When that final cup is turned over, it will signify the end of a time in history when 80 brave men fought the enemy at a time when we needed their courage, their heroism.
I would like to have them remember our group as being a group of people who, at a dangerous time, were willing to put their lives on the line to do what our country needed at the particular time.
There was never a finer bunch of people. I've been in other units that have come pretty close, but the lasting friendships and so forth has been very important.
The guys that I have known on the Doolittle Raid are some of the finest guys I know. And Jim was a very, very special man. And I doubt if there's anybody else as a leader could have developed the comradeship that we have other than a guy like Jim.
Somehow they're like sons to me, that group of boys, all 80 of them, and I'm very grateful indeed that the good Lord gave me this wonderful family.
Of all the people that he has commanded, I love you the best. And he said that.
The 80 men who volunteered for Doolittle's top-secret mission trained for several weeks without understanding what they were preparing for. Doolittle once told them that if they got nosy, he'd hand them over to the FBI. The secrecy obviously worked. Doolittle's raid was a total surprise to the Japanese and the entire American public.